There once was a little boy about the age of 7, and one day he decided he had enough with the city life. He decided to run away. And his older brother, being 3 years older than him, and a little bit jealous of him, decided that he was going to just help him. So the two young boys went about packing up the essentials, candy, mostly candy, some clothes, an extra pair of shoes, because where he was going were streams, but most importantly, his Game Boy. They packed up all these things in their parents' old blue suitcase. He basically stole his parents' suitcase. With $3 in hand, he set off to the local drugstore and bought some Mountain Dew and beef jerky, manly things that a 7-year-old needs. And then he continued his travels to the woods that were about a half mile from his house, a far trek for a 7-year-old. The boy was smart enough to know that he needed shelter, so while hiking in these woods, he looked for a tree where he could set up shop. Finding an overgrown, fallen tree, the boy decided that this was going to be his new home. He put down his suitcase and went about exploring his new surroundings. After what seemed like 2 hours, but in fact was only 15 minutes, the boy settled back into his tree and went about entertaining himself, i.e., playing his Game Boy. And after playing for about 3 hours, everything started to unravel. First, he drank all of his Mountain Dew. He only bought a 20-ounce. The next thing was beef jerky, all gone. And then being a 7-year-old, he ate his candy in one gulp. Surviving the wild obviously takes a lot of energy and a lot of sugar. Finally, his Game Boy ran out of juice, and he wasn't smart enough to pack batteries. So, thirsty, hungry, and bored, the boy decided that he had spent enough time away from home in the woods to satisfy his craving. He decided that he was going to go home. But little did he know that there was a hysterical woman waiting for him at home. Unbeknownst to the boy, his mother had been running around looking for him, because she didn't know that he was going to run away. He didn't announce it. So when she asked her husband, the reply was, "I don't know where he is." And so she didn't ask the older brother, who didn't pipe in, on his own accord, that he wanted to let her know where his brother was. So she looked in the basement, in his room, in the backyard, at the neighbors, nowhere to be found. So it was about that time that the older brother thought that it was time to tell her. So he told her that he had helped his younger brother pack the suitcase so that he could run away. What? So the mom screamed. Now in full-fledged panic mode, she called the first person she could think of, the police chief, a member of their church. Now, it wasn't a town of 2,000 or 10,000, but of 200,000. So the police chief was a busy man. He told the mom that the police couldn't help her until it was classified as a missing person, which was a bit of time over when she called. So she gathered up the father and the older brother to go out looking for the boy. It was about that time that the boy came back into sight of house and family. And when his mom saw him, comes running up to him saying, "Will, where were you?" And then my mother proceeded to tell me that she had been typically, as I might add, worried sick about me. She told me about how she ran around the neighborhood, about how she even called the police. And she had proof because the police chief called and left a message while they were out looking around. So I was scolded, but mostly I was lavished with overjoyed love that I was able to be found and return home. Mostly what I remember, though, is my mom screaming at me, "Where were you?" I think this must have been how Mary was acting during today's scripture lesson, because Jesus and his parents went to Jerusalem every year for the Passover celebration, and the routine was probably the same. Go down with family and friends. Have a festive time with family and friends. And when that festival is over, go home with family and friends. This is probably why it took Mary and Joseph a day to realize that their son wasn't with them. They weren't bad parents, they just expected Jesus to know the routine and go home when it was time. When they did realize that Jesus wasn't with them, Mary and Joseph did like my mom and searched in the usual places. They asked their friends and family. When they couldn't find them, they retraced their steps and went back to Jerusalem. They found Jesus at the temple and asked him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." This word anxiety tells us that Mary and Joseph were worried parents just like my mother. They weren't probably calm saying, "Child, why have you treated us like this?" but more when they saw him screamed at him, "Where were you, Jesus? I was worried sick about you." Now these words, "Where were you?" have lots of meanings. Like in the two stories, they can be uttered by parents who found their lost children. But these words, "Where were you?" can also bring people who weren't family together. An event can galvanize an entire generation so that they ask each other, "Where were you?" and camaraderie is built. One happened on an early morning in what was then Hawaii territory. It was the event that ushered in the United States into the Second Great War, with 2,402 soldiers killed, 1,247 wounded, and between 83 and 103 civilians either killed or wounded. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was such an event. It left those who were living on that day to come together with the common question, "Where were you when you heard about it?" That question pretty much defined the greatest generation and how they responded. Another happened not too far from here. The country had been making strides, and they had started the process of ensuring that all had equal eyes under the law. And the public had not even elected their first Catholic president, a major step because of Protestant prejudice. So it came as a shock that moments after the Texan First Lady, Nellie Connolly, told him, "Mr. President, you can't say that Dallas doesn't love you," that JFK was shot and killed. Schools were let out early. Both women and men wept openly. Joseph F. Dinnen wrote, "A sniper's bullets hit the nation Friday with the impact of an atomic bomb." Where were you when you heard about President Kennedy's assassination? Became all anyone could talk about and is one of the most remembered things in the United States history. $2,996 dead, more than 6,000 wounded. 2 planes flew into the World Trade Center in New York City, causing the towers to collapse. Another plane flew into the Pentagon in Arlington, and one last plane was taken down in a field in Pennsylvania. September 11th, 11 years ago, is a date that few will forget, most will remember. For me, in my generation, it's my "Where were you?" When I asked one of my fraternity brothers from college this week, he was instantaneous in his response. I didn't even have to ask the year. I could have been asking about this year, because it was my dad's 50th birthday. But he was quick to answer and quick to know what I meant. He said, "I was in my 6th grade geometry class. My teacher stopped class after hearing other teachers clamoring out in the hallways. She heard what was going on, immediately turned on the TV, and we just watched the news for the rest of the day." Will, I actually cried. I understood what it meant even in the 6th grade. A single event can bring people together. People have no similarities. It can have so much power that everybody remembers it. A single event can have so much impact that someone can remember exactly where they were, exactly what they were doing when somebody asks, "Where were you?" He was a man who had done some bad things in his life. While not directly murdering anyone, he was present when executions took place and was even presented with the dead bodies. He persecuted people just because they were of a particular sect of religion, one that was different than his own. And so one day he was called to leave his city and go to another large city so that he could arrest some of those he was persecuting, question them, and eventually execute them. While he was walking on this road, he had an experience almost like any other. He had a divine revelation, and his eyes were opened. He saw that not only were his old ways wrong, and that his actions were unjustified, but that the people he was going to arrest were right. His whole life was changed, and from that point onward, he dedicated his life to spreading of the beliefs of those who he was persecuting. He quite literally had a come-to-Jesus moment, for who I am describing is Paul the Apostle. An experience he had was commonly called the road to Damascus. There was another man, about 1900 years later, who was brought up in a Christian household, but the faith didn't stick. He became an atheist during his adolescence because his going to church felt like a chore. He felt like it shouldn't feel like a chore, so there shouldn't be a God. He lived his life this way until he met a friend and colleague when he was 28 years old. In conversations with this friend, opened his mind to the possibility of God. But it wasn't until one night when he was 31, 3 years later, where his eyes truly opened. He says, "You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen, a college at the University of Oxford. You must picture me in that room night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed. Perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England." These are the words of C.S. Lewis, the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, and it's his story of how he became a believer. And so if you ask these two men, Paul the Apostle and C.S. Lewis, the question of where were you, without adding any ending clause to the question, the answers you would get would assuredly be on the road to Damascus, on the floor at Magdalen. This is because the event that defined their life was not a terrorist attack, an assassination, or even an act of war, but the time when they first knew that God loved them. These two famous men had what we call in today's language a born-again experience. It's an experience where you are left with the feeling to become committed to God for the first time in your life, or for a second, or third, or fourth, as in the case of Lewis. And so I'm left hearing these stories with the question of, where was I? And I have a harder time with this because my particular history of faith in church, I grew up in the church. My grandfather was a minister, and so I was dedicated in that church. And I grew up there, went to Sunday school, went to youth group. I was taught from a very young age about the love of God, both capital and lowercase l, by my parents who were ministers, who weren't ministers, and my grandparents who were. There was never a time in my life where I really didn't have faith, nor was there a time I was living outside a community of believers. Assuredly, I am the minority, and I am the lucky. Sure, I did run away that one time when I was 7, but I came back. But there is a time where I remember where it all clicked. There's more than one, but this one sticks out on me. It's a time where it all made sense, where I saw the love of God right in front of me. It isn't a born-again experience, but I do know where I realized that God loved me and that I loved God. When I was 16 years old, I was a part of our youth group, our CYF. And it's similar to the size of our youth group here. There were 4 or 5 core members. They showed up every week. And among this core were a pair of brother and sister. I say pair because they were fraternal twins, Christina and Matt. And these twins were a handful because they were conceived as crack babies. Their mother took drugs while they were pregnant and while nursing. And so it fell upon their grandmother to raise them because their mother could not. And their grandmother's patience was wearing thin. And I could see it, and many people in the church could see it. In short, they were a lot to handle. And so one Wednesday night, the youth group was going to serve dinner at the local homeless shelter. And Matt and Christina were coming along to help us. So I knew that it might be a difficult time. But much to my surprise, it wasn't. The twins were never in the way, nor did they make much trouble. Indeed, they helped us serve the food without incident. A minor miracle for these two. After the serving was done, we went out to the cafeteria and sat with the men and women who came for the meal that night. When I was sitting at a table, when I heard a conversation going on behind me, it was Matt and Christina talking to a homeless man. And again, this is a minor miracle because they were both extremely introverts and they had problems talking to strangers. So much to my surprise, when the homeless man asked them why they were here, what they were doing, and why they were doing it, they answered, because our youth group wants to show God's love. And this brought a smile and a tear to the man's face. And he got up, thanked them, left, took a shower, and went to sleep with a full belly, thanks to Christina and Matt. It was at that moment that I knew what the power of God's love could do. I saw 2 twins with special needs have more mature understanding of God than I did at that time. And I saw that no matter who you are and no matter where you are, that God loves you. And taking that out logically, I knew that that meant that God loved me. And for that, I loved God and love God. Paul was on the road to Damascus. C.S. Lewis was on the floor at Magdalene. I was in a homeless shelter with Christina and Matt. Where were you?